When we were out and about in the neighborhood, we heard this a few times. Oh, your baby doesn't look like a preemie at all. And my first thought was, of course it doesn't. The NICU is behind us. But then I found myself wondering, what do people actually imagine when they picture a former preemie? That question became very real when we met the head of NICU at a hospital in another city, completely randomly on a train when my son was about one corrected age. He mentioned that something had told him my son was a former preemie even before we started chatting, and he was genuinely glad to meet us because he rarely gets to see how these children are doing once they leave the NICU. And he even took and shared this photo that I'm using for the thumbnail of this episode. When I asked how he could possibly know, he said he couldn't quite pin it down, but it was more of a gut feeling. I guess it's from seeing hundreds of preemies every year for decades. I've heard similar things from the NICU nurses that they could sometimes just sense it. So that got me curious. What are the things that stay in former preemies? Hi, this is Never Too Early. Today, I want to walk through the lasting features that some former preemies carry, physical, hidden, and neurological, so that when we notice those in our children, we can meet them with understanding instead of worry. First, head shape. In the NICU, extreme preemies spend weeks or months lying in the incubator. The skull at this stage is very, very soft and malleable, and prolonged side positioning causes it to flatten on the sides and elongate, creating a head that is longer and narrower than usual. This is called Dolichocephaly, and it's commonly called toaster head in the NICU. I covered this in detail back in chapter 2. Research found that moderate or severe dolichocephaly occurred in over 80% of very preterm infants during their NICU stay. It does improve over time as a baby grows and moves more freely. Most cases normalize significantly through the first year and continue improving into childhood. My son's head shape resolved very well despite my worries during the NICU stay, which is the typical outcome. If the shape hasn't resolved by 5 or 6 months of age, helmet therapy is sometimes recommended. Second, CPAP nose shape. The CPAP prongs press against the soft nasal cartilage for weeks or months. In very preterm babies, that cartilage is exceptionally soft and gets shaped by the sustained pressure, resulting in a widened nostril flare or a slightly altered nasal shape. This is a well documented complication. One Dutch NICU study found that over 90% of infants developed some form of nasal pressure injury from CPAP, with severity correlating to gestational age and length of time on CPAP. Most nasal shape changes improve as the cartilage firm up through the first 1 to 2 years, but some degree of nostril shape can persist. My son still has a slight nostril flare at the age of 3, which I mentioned in chapter 2 as well. And it's completely cosmetic and it doesn't cause any functional issues. Third, scars. Many former preemies carry permanent marks from their NICU time, like IV sites on their hands or feet, and surgical scars. I know a lot of parents worry about these, especially in the early years. These scars do become less prominent over time, but may not completely disappear. They are a completely normal part of our preemie's NICU history. As children grow older and start asking about the scars, you can maybe embrace it as a part of their story, which I learned to do from German doctors and nurses. First, lung functions. Former extreme preemies have significantly higher rates of asthma and reduced lung capacity. This is invisible. The child looks completely fine on the outside, but it could show up during illness, physical activity, or when respiratory demands increase. In the early years, this often just looks like more frequent chest infections or more struggle with catching a cold. It tends to improve as they grow and their lungs mature, but it's worth being aware of. Second, feeding and oral sensitivity. Around 80% of preterm infants experience feeding difficulties during their hospital stay. That's how common it is in the NICU itself. And research found that around 43% of preterm infants still have feeding difficulties at 6 to 12 months of age after discharge. At home, it could look like strong food preferences, sensitivity to textures, gagging on certain foods, slow eating, real discomfort with anything new or unexpected in the mouth. This is a direct consequence of what happened to their mouth in the NICU, like prolonged intubation, tube feeding, and repeated oral suctioning. Their earliest oral experiences were medical and often very, very uncomfortable. If your preemie is a challenging eater, this context matters. It's not just pickiness, it has a real starting point. First, sensory sensitivity. This is one of the most significant and most consistently documented lasting features of extreme prematurity. Studies have found that between 40 to 50% of children born very preterm show atypical sensory processing patterns by early childhood. In practice, this looks like sensitivity to loud sounds, strong textures, unexpected touches, and or crowded environments. Things that feel manageable to another children can feel very overwhelming. This is not a behavioral problem. It's a direct result of the sensory environment these babies were in at the NICU. Bright lights, constant alarms, painful procedures, all during the window when their sensory systems were supposed to be quietly forming in the dark womb. Their nervous system learned to be on alert, and that takes time to settle. Sensory sensitivity does improve as the nervous system matures, but for many former preemies, it stays for a long time. Knowing that changes how you work with it rather than against it. Second, preference for routine and order. Connected to the sensitivity, there is a strong preference for structure and predictability. It could look like a child who needs to know what comes next, who doesn't handle transitions easily, or who can become genuinely unsettled by changes that other children barely even notice. This makes complete sense neurologically. A nervous system that was overwhelmed in its earliest weeks and months naturally seeks environment it can predict and control. We saw this very clearly in our son from early on, and we are kind of working with it. We give him tasks to manage in order or ask him to remind us the to do list so that he is aware of what's next while doing what he loves, which is memorizing. At the annual Preemie festivals at the hospital where we stayed, I saw that overwhelming majority of the Preemie graduates, the children of various ages, were simply getting on with their lives, completely indistinguishable from any other children of their age. Most former Preemies seem to just grow into people who show very little of their tough start. But I also did see a very few children at the festival who seemed to have more significant lasting challenges with walking or vision or communication. This is real for a small group, and it's usually connected to the most serious complications of extreme prematurity: major brain bleeds, severe lung damage, significant surgical interventions. Prematurity alone doesn't determine the outcome. It's the complication that matter most. And modern neonatal care continues to reduce the most serious of those. It's interesting that people with enough experience can sometimes just sense a child's NICU history even years later. And it's useful for us as preemie parents to understand what those features actually are so that when we notice them in our children, we can meet them with understanding rather than worry. Some of these things resolve entirely, some soften over time, and some stay for a long time. And none of them determine what our preemies are capable of. I also hope this is helpful for the family and friends of preemie children as a gentle reminder that some of what shows has real roots, and that awareness may prevent you from misunderstanding. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one. This is Never Too Early.